Hello, readers and writers. Thank you guys for coming tonight. This is our New Voices in Fiction event hosted by the program on creative writing. I'm Rachel Dwoskin. I teach fiction in the program, and I am delighted to be introducing Julia May Jonas, who will be introducing our wonderful student, June Villers, before each reads. This is Julia's book. It's on sale in the back of the room, courtesy of the Lovely Sem Co-op. Please buy a copy. It's hard for me, in spite of my rapturous love of hyperbole, to describe how pleased I am that Julia May Jonas said yes to our introduction. She's a triple plus threat, a professor, playwright, director, and dynamite novelist. She founded and runs a theater company called Nellie Tinder and has taught at Skidmore and sometimes NYU, and she lights, to my mind, scalding and hilarious fires in her work. Her debut novel, Vladimir, is full of brilliantly difficult questions about power, sex, love, intellectual wonder, and art. It opens with the irresistible, slightly scandalous sentence, "When I was a child, I loved old men, and I could tell that they also loved me." Her protagonist, an unnamed English professor whose husband is being investigated for inappropriate relationships with former students, puts it like this: "I believed that art was not a moral enterprise, that morality in art was what happened when the church or the state got involved, that if you insisted on infusing art with morality, you would insist on lies and limits. Truth could be found only outside the confines of morality. Art needed to be taken and rejected on its own terms. Art was not the artist." Were these all simply platitudes I had absorbed without question? Should we only portray the world we wanted to see? A real artist, Jonas doesn't pretend to answer those questions. She complicates, invests in nuance, and writes prose that is shimmeringly clear and funny in a way that peels up simple answers to expose additional questions underneath. She's a wonder, and I can't wait to hear her reading and thinking. I'm so happy she's here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Julia May Jonas to the University of Chicago.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. What a privilege it is to be here and to be introduced in such a wonderful way. I'm so happy to be with you tonight on your beautiful campus on this incredibly gorgeous day. So thank you for coming in from outside to see this. I'm going to read 3 different sections, or maybe I'll read 2 if the second section feels especially long. So we'll see how we do. I'm going to start with reading from the prologue, which needs no introduction. When I was a child, I loved old men, and I could tell that they also loved me. They loved how eager I was to please them, how much I wanted them to think well of me. They would wink at me and find me precocious. I would encounter them at church and at family gatherings, and as friends of my friends' parents. They were the husbands of my dance instructors or my science or history teachers. Their approval filled me with pleasure. When I remember my childhood, I'm wearing a white dress with a blue accent. Girls in White Dresses, a song written by an old man. That is not what I wore, but it is what I remember myself wearing, especially when I interacted with old men. I remember feeling like a classic young girl and thinking that my goodness shone out of me. Goodness and intelligence radiated from my eyes, and the men recognized it, even the oldest and most cantankerous. I still like many of the things old men tend to enjoy. Jazz music, folk music, the blues, guitar virtuosity, long, well-researched histories, existentialists and muscular writers, depravity and funny, violent criminals, emotional rock and roll, meanness. I like folksy stories of city life or country life or anecdotes about political history. I like clever jokes and talking about the mechanics of jokes and turns of phrase and card games and war stories. What I like most about old men now, however, and the reason I often feel that I perhaps am an old man more than I am an oldish white woman in her late 50s, the identity I am burdened with publicly presenting to my general embarrassment, is that old men are composed of desire. Everything about them is wanting. They have appetites for food, boats, vacations, entertainment. They want to be stimulated. They want to sleep. They are guided by desire. Their world is made up of their desires. For the old men who I am thinking of, and perhaps I mean a certain kind of old man that I encountered and that has enshrined itself in my mind from youth, they do not know or cannot imagine a kind of world that is not completely and totally guided by a sense of wanting and getting. And of course, they desire the adoration of a sexual partner, even if only in their imaginations, through the blue light of their television screens. I wrote the above words while looking at Vladimir and his tawny, well-formed head leaning against the wooden chair. His bold, you could call it protruding, forehead catches the light, illuminating the drum-tight skin atop the manly cranial bulges. At 40, he is the kind of man whose face will grow tighter before it softens. His grayish blonde hair rests like mussed hay, plentiful now, but with the threat of translucence and eventual absence in years to come. He is asleep in the chair, and the hair on his left arm, the one that I have not shackled, glows in the late afternoon sun. The sight of that arm hair ablaze in the sun sends a sob down my spine. I run my fingers over its springy softness as lightly as a tiny, courteous insect. The chair is big, medieval style, made of dark brown pine, the finish soft with use. It came from a junk shop, and before that a beer hall on Route 9 that went out of business. The wood is covered with gummy black carvings of names and initials, some pairings encircled by hearts, some with dates. When I'm trying to find inspiration, I will zero in on a set of initials, JS plus RB 1987. I will make up names for the initials, Jae Soon and Robert Black, let's say, a gay couple who moved upstate from New York City, fleeing the horror of the AIDS crisis. Architects, both of them, Jae, the son of immigrant Korean parents, born and raised in Flushing, Queens, and Robert Black, son of a Mayflower family, a blue-blooded black sheep, pun lightly intended. They buy a rambling Victorian and decorate it in obsessive style, finding antiques and oddities possible only in the age before the internet, before everyone understood what everything was worth, from Eames chairs to vintage 60s kitsch figurines. One night they venture out in their new town and stumble across a beer hall. It is a warm spring, and they sit outside romantically beneath trees that are heavy and dripping with flower petals. Jae becomes tipsy and affectionate, and Robert, frightened of the upstate town and the chunky groups of chunky men who, if not members of, at least draw aesthetic inspiration from Hell's Angels, pushes him away. They quarrel badly and go home angry, Jae feeling humiliated, Robert feeling helpless. Much later, after they have made up, Robert, on his own, comes to the beer hall and carves their initials into the chair. And on the first anniversary of their life in this upstate town, brings Jae to sit in that chair and shows him the carving. Then they spontaneously combust. For example, Vladimir snores lightly, a soft, soothing purr of a snore. It's a sweet, even sound. If I lived with him, if I were his little wife, I would wrap myself around him and let that snore lull me to sleep, like the sound of a rushing ocean. I could tidy the cabin. The limes from our drinks are squashed on the counter. Our shoes in the mudroom point every which way. I could write more, work on my book, but instead I want to sit and stare at the light as it moves across him. I am aware of this moment as a perfect example of liminality. I am living in the reality before Vladimir wakes. I wish some of my students who have a post-adolescent passion for literary terms were here. I'm sure if they were, they could feel it. The no-placeness and no-timeness of now. The pulsing presence of this moment between moments. And now I'm going to read a bit later in the timeline. It's actually earlier. She's just met Vladimir, and he has come over to their house for a pool party. And then he's left. He stayed until the sun went down. I was glad to have cleaned the house because after it was too cold to swim, we went inside and John played the piano for us, and we sang some folk and pop songs for Fee, who danced around the living room, clutching and kissing a ragged piece of red fabric Vlad said was the only thing she played with. Then he put her in front of the television, and we had gin and tonics on the porch, watching the last light in the sky. He kept asking if it was all right that they were staying, and we kept insisting how much we were enjoying their presence. He didn't want to leave. It felt like young love, I thought, responsibilities looming, the mounting anxiety of your life building while you clung, lolling pointlessly in bed, to a new someone who gave you a sad and fearful pleasure. I did worry that something about the afternoon had made us appear parental to him. John wasn't exactly slapping me on the ass or throwing his arms around me and kissing me, but we were pretending and enjoying to pretend a communication and solidarity we hadn't felt in a long while. Had Vlad's wife been there, we would have been two couples, peers, fellow academics, and co-workers. But because she was gone, we seemed to take on the role of an august mentor couple. And why shouldn't we, I kept telling myself. John was 63, I was 58 now. Though I wasn't really old enough to be his mother, I was old enough to be his mother. He continued to flirt with both of us throughout the evening, laughing loudly and repeatedly touching me on the arm and shoulder, so much so that he even commented on and apologized for it, and I shrugged it off, pretending I hadn't noticed. I drove the conversation toward intellectual concerns and politics, forcing discussion like I would do with my students. We talked about the rise of autofiction and how most of the creative writing students at the college did not even want to write fiction, but creative nonfiction instead, and primarily autofiction and memoir. I said it was because they were so obsessed with themselves they couldn't imagine existing outside their viewpoint. John said it came from an anxiety about representing identities and experiences other than their own. Vlad posited it was because they had grown up online, representing themselves via avatars, building brands and presences and constructions of selves before they even knew that's what they were doing. We talked about the rise of populist ideology, both on the left and the right. Cautiously sidestepping any Title IX discussion, we talked about how different the college used to be, rigorous but freewheeling, drugs, drinking, sex, and how neutered the kids were now, calling their moms every day, prizing friendship over romance. Philomena drank so much lemonade that she threw up on Vlad's shirt. John lent him a linen button-down, the kind of shirt for touring amphitheaters during Grecian summers, and with it hanging off his tanned body, Vlad looked like Jay Gatsby, or the owner of a yacht. When finally Philomena fell asleep on the couch, Vlad picked her up in his arms to leave. Truthfully, he said he was just so relieved he didn't have to do bedtime. He had been hoping she would fall asleep in the car on the way home, but this was even better. We watched him go from the front doorway. As his car pulled out of the driveway, John leaned down and whispered, "Are you in love?" And I walked away from him so quickly it was as if I jumped. He followed me into the kitchen and began to help me clean in silence. But after a few minutes, in which his bustling presence became more and more unbearable, I snapped at him to leave me alone. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. I had drunk more alcohol than usual that afternoon, and though I knew I was angry with him, I also knew I wouldn't be able to find the correct phrasing to tell him why. He pressed and pressed, becoming more and more aggressive, until finally I told him to fuck off, and that as far as I was concerned, he was a sadist. It wasn't the right word, but I couldn't express how he had taken a beautiful, almost spiritual afternoon, the kind of afternoon one remembers long after it has passed, and ruined it for no reason with his cruel and leering comment. In response, he, drunker than me, volatile and irascible, emptied the full recycling bag he was holding onto the floor so that beer bottles and plastic clamshells tumbled out onto the tile. He told me I was a miserable woman and accused me of taking a shit on every nice thing, all because of what other people thought, not even what I thought. I told him what other people thought had nothing to do with anything, and besides, he was the one who took a shit on things. He was the one, he did that. And then I lowered my voice and told him I couldn't go on like this anymore. He told me, "Fine then, please, file for divorce, please," miming begging gestures and histrionically picking up the scattered recycling he had spilled and throwing it back into the bag. I watched his display with what I knew was a look of ugly disdain, then laughed and told him not to worry. I was seriously considering it. He paused, then threw the empty tin can he was holding at the wall to my right, and let loose on me a torrent of blame and expletives so foul and hideous that I can't repeat them, other than to say that by the end I felt there was a sandbag in my stomach, and my head hurt from crying, and my limbs felt limp, and I couldn't finish cleaning. I could barely even walk to my bed before succumbing to a sleep that felt like the heaviness of death. The next morning we resumed our distant cohabitation, contrite but bruised from our inebriated altercation. I wrote to Vladimir about his book. I told him that I deeply admired it and that I would like to take him out to lunch once the semester got rolling to discuss it. I hadn't brought it up the day before because John hadn't read it, and I didn't want to hurt Vladimir or embarrass John. As the day wore on and I didn't hear back from him, I began to feel more and more sick about what had transpired at our home the day before. I went over it in my mind. Was I too eager, somehow tense or hovering? Was he mad about the lemonade, or did I talk too much in the conversation? Did I interrupt him? I was known to interrupt. I hated this about myself. Did he think I was merely unworthy of his time and respect? But no, I didn't want to work myself up like that. It was Sunday. He wasn't on his email. Nobody writes back right away on a Sunday. At around 2 p.m, I took a drive to my cabin near the lake, an hour north and west of where we were, where the reception was non-existent unless you hooked up to the Wi-Fi. The last renter of the season had gone the week before, and I needed to bring in the outdoor furniture and lock up the boats before it was too cold. I had received an inheritance when one of my childless uncles on my father's side died, a moderate sum of money with which I bought a modest amount of property with a little entryway to a medium-sized lake that didn't allow motors. After clearing and replanting the trees and leveling the ground, I bought a prefabricated, non-winterized log cabin and had it installed along with the dock. I had purchased it as a retreat for myself, a summer writing cabin, though since it was built I had rented it out, first to help pay for Sydney's college, then her law school, and now to help her with her student loan debt. When I pulled into the gravel drive, I was surprised to see that the cleaning service I used had clearly not come. There was a tipped-over garbage can from which trash was traveling across the driveway. The service usually took the garage to the local dump. I chased crumpled fast food wrappers and drink containers, balled-up napkins, and rotten fruit skins across the lawn. The cabin, when I entered, was picked up, but there was a tacky film of use over all the surfaces, the mildewy smell of damp towels and used sheets piled up by the washing machine, toothpaste marks, and a ring of foundation left on the bathroom counter. The last tenants had been a couple with a young child and grandmother, like how we used to travel with John's mother before Sydney turned 8, old enough to go to the Frick, and became good enough company that we did not require a babysitter. The small bedroom where I imagined the grandmother had stayed smelled of powder. The big one where the couple and their daughter must have slept smelled of sweat. I was sure that there was many years before my daughter would have a child, if ever. When she was very little, and I would ask her what she wanted to be when she grew up, she would say, a mom. And if I asked her what else, she would say, a babysitter. Now she was a lawyer for a not-for-profit similar to the ACLU and would perform the sign of the hex if children were mentioned. Still, I considered the small bedroom and my eventual relegation to it. If I stayed with John, we would get the big bedroom, out of deference to our matriarchy and patriarchy. But if we split up, it would be cots and sofa beds and small bedrooms for me. My worth would be equal to how helpful, useful, and uncomplaining I could be. I would be tolerated as long as it was clear I appreciated the cots, the sofa beds, the small bedrooms. I would have to demonstrate gratitude for the scraps and crumbs of time, attention, money, and luxury that came my way. I would work for it, with early mornings watching the baby or nights doing dishes after everyone fell asleep. I couldn't be particular. Particular old women are not invited on vacations, unless they are very rich, which I was not. The cabin was wooden inside and out, the logs of the exterior making up the walls of the interior. The main part was one large room, the kitchen taking up one corner, a dining table in another, and the remainder a sitting room framed by 2 large glass doors that opened out to a small deck and a view of the lake. There was a hallway that led to the 2 bedrooms, 2 hall closets, a washer-dryer nook, and a small bathroom. I unlocked the closet where the cleaning supplies were kept. Despite feeling slightly disturbed when I saw the garbage swirling all over the lawn and irritating that I was going to have to track down the cleaning service, I was looking forward to scrubbing the house. Something to get my back into. I began by drawing the microfiber feather duster over all the high surfaces to knock down the dust, then cleaning the windows, then the mid-level surfaces, and then the floors. High to low, like my mother taught me, so the last thing to go was all the dirt you knocked down. In the bathroom, I wiped down the counters and sinks, scrubbed the shower, then the toilet, then got on my hands and knees to wipe the bathroom floor. The side caddies of the refrigerator were filled with the hot sauce and dressing whims of all the combined summer renters, which I packed into a large cooler to take home. I wiped some stuck maple syrup out of a drawer and brushed some green flakes that looked like spilled frozen spinach out of the freezer. There was a lone ice cream sandwich, s'more flavor, printed on its label in the back corner. I took a bite and spit it out. It was chewy with freezer burn. When the blankets, sheets, and towels were out of the dryer, I folded them, wrapped them in clear plastic bags, and packed them in a large Rubbermaid garbage can that kept them safe from mold and mice and moths. I was about to go pull the kayaks into the storage shed when I was struck with an urge I hadn't felt, not truly, in years. The urge, the want, felt almost orgasmic, like being inches away from someone's mouth, knowing you are about to kiss them for the first time. It was the real and true urge to write, not the sit down and make yourself write feeling, in which you perform a number of tricks to start the words flowing, if they ever do, but the desperate desire to actually grip a pen and watch as ink travels over the page, the actual urge to say something. Of course, there was barely anything to write on in the cabin. Unwilling to destroy any of the books by writing in their back pages or margins, I rummaged through the house until I remembered a pack of Post-its I'd left in the drawer with a long lighter for the grill. I scratched the lone pen against the paper for several seconds before the ink began to flow. I wrote until the sun went down, Post-it after Post-it, all the while my body vibrating with that near sexual energy. It was the beginning of a story about improbability, about coincidence meeting circumstance. It was a fairy tale or the start of one about what one hopes to happen against all odds, happening. The voice I wrote with felt new to me, unrestrained. For years I had been trying to cool down the temperature of my writing, to pull it back, pull it back, pull it back, neutralize it, contain it, make it crisp, clear, and sharp, every word carved out of crystal. This writing was nothing like that. It was drippy, messy, breezy. I was working through a mind frame, not a conceit. I was creating a world, not words on the page. I found the writing so intoxicating that I even considered stopping to masturbate, engorged by the creative juice, to use a hackneyed phrase, that was rushing through my veins. But the sheer ease with which I wrote was too precious. I couldn't stop it. I wanted to preserve this tingling, energetic tension that pulsed within me. Oh, it was him. It was all because of him, I knew. Him and his book and his body and the way he spread his legs and looked at me in the black glass of the window. It was him and his tragic wife and his sad yet triumphant story. I was writing to him. He who wasn't the least bit interested in me. I was writing to explain myself to him. If I couldn't have him, perhaps I didn't even want him, I at least wanted him to know me, who I was and how I felt. I wrote till the sun waned and the Post-its were all used up, then wrenched myself away. I had to prep for tomorrow's classes and review the language of the department goals before a Monday morning meeting. I didn't listen to anything on the drive back. I thought through the next 5 plot points in the story. When I arrived home, John was sitting outside. I sat down with him. I put my hand on his knee, rather. He shifted toward me and I put my head on his shoulder. That night we fucked for the first time in a year, with a clawing, otherworldly intensity. I woke up in the big bed, as we used to call it, in the early morning and moved to the guest room. I felt exhausted and disturbed, as though a multitude of ghosts had passed through my body the night before. And I think that's quite enough reading. So we can move on to questions, yeah? Yeah. Yes, you can clap. So I think I'm, yeah.
Well, can I just ask you about that moment?
Sure.
I mean, there are a lot of creative writing students here, of course, and a lot of writers here, but what is it about the experience of writing or being creatively inspired that is like this kind of sexual desire, at least for the narrator.
For the narrator, yeah, and I think in general, I mean, I think there's a real libidinousness. There we go, libidinousness to creativity. I think that the act of generating something. I mean, if everything is about perspective and how you turn your gaze onto it. But if you can turn your gaze onto creation in that way, there is a kind of eroticism, I think, to doing so. Certainly for the narrator, but I think in certain moments, also for writers. I think it's one thing I'm always fascinated with is how thrill is can happen in so many different situations, and we tend to sexualize it. But I was a performer for a long time, and the thrill of stepping on stage, could be equated to the thrill of a sexual encounter, could be equated to the thrill of also writing something when you feel like you're really generating something. So I think the narrator is certainly feeling that, and that is so entrancing that it leads her down some dubious paths. But I also think that's...
But she's kind of afraid of it, too. She says she's stirred.
Yeah.
Not one ghost, there's many ghosts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think she feels like she's taken somewhere else, and she is taken somewhere else, I think, by the sweep of this creative endeavor, and her obsession with Vladimir really couldn't happen if it didn't also spark her own writing, her own agency about it, and I think that's what writing is, such an act of agency. And I think that's what's so intoxicating to her, and that's what she can't kind of give up. But that's also so fearful, to create something. I think writing can feel quite scary, especially when you're making something and you realize that you're making something that didn't ever exist before, and it's coming out of you, and that you're attached to it in some way. I think all of those things can feel so threatening in a way. Threatening and excited and scared, as Stephen Sondheim would say.
Speaking of which, can you talk a little bit about the genesis of the book and how and why you wrote it, and to what extent it, intersects with or diverges from your playwriting and your other work?
Sure, yeah. So I actually wrote this began in 2018. I thought I would write a play about a wife whose husband is being embroiled in a kind of a Title IX situation, and I thought I wanted to make her into an actual person. That was, fundamentally my main desire. And the play ended up being, it was like a 2-actor play where the actors played a multitude of different characters, and it kind of became about talking about desire and how we account for desire and how we record it, almost after the fact. And it also started to pose this question of, can you... It started to include a lot of Nabokov references, and it started to become about this idea of can you teach Lolita, can you engage with Lolita, how do you engage with Lolita? So that was the play, and I got to about 75 pages, and it was going nowhere. I kept making things up, and that's when a play is going down the wrong path, and so I put it away. And then the pandemic happened, and I had all these theatrical projects that were canceled, and I found that I really couldn't write for theater, and I had always written prose, but I had never kind of clicked in with it, in that way. Not that it's magical, but I hadn't. I had always been called away to do a workshop of a play or something. Theater is so physically immediate that it's very, very hard to force yourself to say no to it, because there are all these people that you can talk to about your writing immediately, which is a kind of thing that doesn't happen when you're writing long-form fiction. However, that didn't exist, so I thought about one of the characters in that play, who was again this wife, and I had a scene in which she was showing a younger professor colleague her things, which is the first scene in the book after the prologue. And I wrote it out, and I thought, okay, yes, I think that this is the reason that play wasn't working because it was the wrong form. that it needed this interiority, it needed an intimacy with the reader, it needed a sense of complicity. It's very difficult to be complicit with plays because you have bodies in front of you who you can't have the same kind of complex reading relationship with that you can have in fiction. They become very solid and other, which is why plays are good for other things, but not necessarily that sense of intimacy. And that's what I realized it needed. And so once I started that, that's where I went from there. Yes.
So last year, this name Vladimir has special connotations.
Yes.
For example, when I saw first your book, I saw the biography of Vladimir Putin.
You would be disappointed.
So would you comment on this?
Well, it wasn't intentional at the time. I mean, certainly I acknowledge that I knew that, that Vladimir Putin existed. But I think it came out very close to when the Ukrainian invasion happened. So
You also say somewhere that my Russian of Vladimir or something, some sentence in the book.
yes, well, I mean, it is the play that the thing that I'm playing off is the relationship to Vladimir Nabokov, and Vladimir is his parents are Russian. His parents are Russian immigrants.
Right.
Yeah. So there is that connection, but the other connection was totally unintentional. Maybe helped, maybe hurt. I don't know.
Many go to read biography of Putin.
I hope so. I hope they did. They would really be in for a surprise. Yes.
I really like the scene moving through the afternoon and the discussion about autofiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how you write those scenes that are building up to the moments of confrontation, like in the kitchen.
Yeah.
How do you fill that space but still make it lively?
I think about when I'm trying to write toward something, which I think can be useful in writing, is thinking about, okay, I'm going to write toward this image. I like to think about it as an accordion folder. So, closed, we go from this part to this part, but then if you open it, you have this space inside of it. I think it's useful to let your characters to think about what the digressions of the afternoon would be, and in some way to kind of pick from it almost like what you would think about the memories. If you were to remember that event, what would you see as the points? She would remember that conversation. She would have this image. And I think it can be very useful to even thinking about it as almost like an image map. I'm going to move from this image to this image to this image to this image, and then we're going to land in this image. And I think also, because I wrote in the first person, I had the benefit of allowing my character to be digressive in her own particular way. And so all of the narrative is about what she remembers, and it's all about how she's crafting the story and all about her perspective. So that's useful. That was useful for me in doing that. But I do think, that writing to a point and then really thinking about then what do we open up around it. Again, that idea of the accordion folder feels very useful to me. Like there's all these pockets and they can be filled with things, but the energy is pushing to the end of the scene. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
We were just talking in my class about kind of the different limitations and different ways you can kind of use different limitations to different forms. And I'm curious, you talked about how when you figured out that you couldn't write this as a play, it needed to be a work of fiction, it kind of found its form. But I was curious, point where the form of fiction became limiting and you found yourself like making use of those limitations creatively? The fact that it wasn't a play and it was a work of fiction?
Yeah, I mean, what's so useful is the myopia of the character. I mean, I think especially when you're writing from first person, but I think even if you're writing from third person, you can still think about what is seen, what is not seen, what is included, what is omitted, and that in fiction, for me, in writing, that's a real strength in fiction, that you're constructing exactly what the reader is experiencing, and so the limitations of that are that you can't do it all, because that would be very tiresome. But the benefits of that is then you're really talking about perspective and the way someone sees things, or the way you see things, or crafting the perspective around the story. And I think, with the play, I had a teacher, Chuck Mee, in graduate school, who writes wonderful plays, and he had been a lawyer or something like that, like a good lawyer. And then he went and saw a play, and he decided he needed to switch to making theater because he was so entranced with this idea that a play is a whole world, which it is. When you look at a play, you have an entire society constructed in front of you. There's the sets, there's the lighting from above, there are the people who are on stage, there's the kind of mental mind fuck that is like the fact that we're all agreeing that these people in front of you are different people than they actually are, and we're all pretending, and yet we're breathing the same air, and they're 6 feet away from us, and we also know that they're real people. So those are all kind of things that are happening inside of theater that make it a very complex thing to take in and very physical. And I find that people get very mad at theater, it makes them more angry than any other form, or more irritated, because of the demands it puts on your body and your attention, because you're taking in so much. So it really is about constructing a world, and when I teach playwriting, I tell my students every single word of dialogue you're writing is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for how the world is. So that's, in a way, very different from what the constraint of fiction is, because you're in fiction, again, you're talking about, a way of seeing the world, and it's not, you're controlling the way that it's seen. So maybe that's a step at answering that question. Yeah.
Hi. I really like what you said about you had a premise that you decided you wanted this narrator's husband to be involved in the Title IX scandal, and you wanted to make her a real person. So my question is, what was the first thing that you knew about the narrator when you tried to make her three-dimensional?
Well, I think that I have a long-standing project of, I grew up on kind of saintly female heroines, like Anne of Green Gables and the women in Little Women, and all of these kind of very formative, early but formative ideas of females who everyone, they would be kind of said to be a little bit naughty, but actually they would be so morally unimpeachable that as a kind of, the child that I was, I found it very intimidating and alienating. And so, from the beginning, I thought about making this heroine not a saint, and infusing her with anger and desire, and particularly, all of the situations kind of thread together. But she's 58 years old. She's reaching an age where many women are thought of are either seen as invisible, or are thought of as becoming doddering, or are their value feels like it's rapidly, her value in her own mind feels like it's rapidly declining in front of her face. So for me, that was essential, that she felt like she was becoming less and less viable, and she was both angry about it and wanted to desperately do something to reclaim that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Another question. Can I go back to the autofiction, Kate mentioned their conversation about autofiction, and what was funny about is that John says something, and she has her point of view about it, and she's a little bit, I guess, critical of the younger generation, and then Vladimir gives his answer, and he's a bit more sympathetic about how this generation has grown up, which has made, writing autofiction more inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I sensed it was that the narrator is kind of, that's not untrue, but whatever. But it seems like the book is saying that might be, Vladimir's answer might be more, sensible. And I just want to pick your thoughts, pick your brain on that. I mean, what do we do with this impulse to write about ourselves?
Yeah.
And what would you say to students about writing about themselves, especially the fear of it?
Yeah. I mean, I think, two or multiple things. I think there's first of all, there's kind of the drama of what that conversation is, and she's trying to impress him and says something cutting and rather stupid. And then he comes back with this kind of much more erudite response that is much more appealing and well thought out. So there's that. But then yes, he absolutely has the more appealing argument and the more sympathetic argument about autofiction. And in terms of the conceit of the book, it's also ironic. This narrator is ostensibly writing an entire book about herself. If anyone's obsessed with themselves, she is. When it comes to writing about yourself, I think that, I guess I always feel like the best thing to do writing early on is connect to what is going to make you feel kind of formally adventurous and free and truthful. And if that's writing about yourself, I think then that's actually, absolutely a way in. I also think, I'm jumping a bit around, but something I always think about for myself is from one of Nabokov's lectures on literature, where he says that all novels are fairy tales. So even if you are writing about yourself, you are writing a fairy tale. You are writing a contained world. And I think if you can hold that in mind as you're writing about yourself. I also had a teacher who would say, are you exploring it or are you stuck? And I think that's a way to approach writing about yourself, especially when you're young. Are you exploring it? Is this an exploration, or is this because you're stuck on something and you need to pull out from yourself? But inherently, I feel like everyone should be able to write about exactly what they want, and I think there are so many writers of autofiction who I profoundly admire. I don't even know, autofiction is such a new term for a thing that's been around for so long. I tend to think that as long as you're thinking about form and experimenting with form, and the drama of the sentence and craft and all of those things, that you should write with what connects and frees you. That's an answer.
Can you give us homework? I want a reading list of the plays you love most and teach, and the novels you love most and teach, or just some examples of them. And then I think we have time for one more question before we liberate you.
Okay. A play I love to recommend, which is tricky reading, but it is very rewarding, is The Duchess of Malfi by John Webster. It is so wacky. It starts off as kind of almost like a comedy, and then it turns into a horror play. The language is insane. It is so shocking what he does, because he starts in one place and you think you're watching one kind of play, and then all of a sudden you're watching a completely different kind of play. So that's a play I always recommend. I also recommend any explorations into Carol Churchill and the way that she works with theater in her language. Particularly, I love Blue. It's called Blue something. There's two plays. One of them is called Blue Kettle, and the other is called, I forget what it's called. But they come in a companion series, and they're extraordinary for being these kind of. I think they're very liberating, especially for young writers who are writing plays, to see what she does with language. And then novels. I just love Iris Murdoch, and I love a novel that I'm very obsessed with is The Sea, which has a very close relationship to this novel. And it also, the thing that Iris Murdoch does that I find so surprising is she does start in a kind of form of realism, and then the story becomes one of just coincidence and surprise, and it goes somewhere completely differently, and then it feels by the end, I think, extremely allegorical and spiritual and philosophical, but it's also so page turny. So that's a novel I really love, and I'll give one more, which is the novel Cousin Bet by Balzac, which is, these are both two big novels, but that's okay. I'll give one more really tiny one and contemporary one too. But Cousin Bet, I love the energy of this book. It's about a woman who decides she's been wronged, and then the entire book is about her getting revenge until everyone is decimated and on the floor. And it's absolutely, an absolutely scorched earth reading experience, and it's very, very also just so astute. Balzac was a failed playwright. He always wanted to be a playwright, but he never made it, and so then he started writing novels. And then the final one that I talk about all the time, but I'll mention, is this book Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss. Sarah Moss is a wonderful English writer, and Ghost Wall is a book that, again, this is becoming a theme, starts out as one thing and then becomes something else. And it is very wonderful, scary, very brief, very beautiful. The language is incredibly shimmering. And it's about basically a father who takes his daughter on a kind of a Iron Age recreation trip around the 1960s or 70s in Britain. And it's excellent. So there's some homework. There's too much homework.
Do you have a final question? Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet? Student question? Okay.
So, does this Cynthia character of your book, Cynthia, make it really feminine? Because she is kind of damaged, and Vladimir writing a letter to accept him because he has wife with problems. In the end of the day, she is writing a book that make famous, and Vladimir is not.
Yeah.
So this masculine title and masculine sort of thing are losing to kind of small damaged woman.
Yeah, I think with the idea of the masculine, the man at the center, I was thinking about, I had one person argue to me that Lolita is Nabokov's response to Pamela and Clarissa, the first novels. And I thought very much about the idea of these novels that put women's names at the center, and that are all about the writer's gaze. And I did think very consciously about trying to flip that gaze and thinking about what if it's not Clarissa or Pamela or Lolita, but a man, and it becomes very immediately transgressive. Yeah, thank you.